Welcome to the CUNY Forum, a special edition of MetroView. I'm Ed Rogowsky. The Forum is the monthly meeting of students and faculty in the City University Internship Program gathered to discuss an important public policy issue. The title for tonight's forum is Planning for New York City, Is the Region at Risk? The phrase Region at Risk is the title of the third plan developed by the Regional Plan Association, the nation's oldest non-governmental planning organization. RPA, as it's known, is credited in its 1929 and 1968 plans with having been an important stimulant for major planning initiatives for the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut tri-state region, involving transportation initiatives, open space, and other improvements to the infrastructure to create, in fact, the links that bring the region together and enable it to function. This third plan of theirs is entitled Region at Risk because they're very concerned with the future of this tri-state region. To talk about the plan and its contents as well as its possibilities for implementation, our guests are Ken Fisher, City Councilman from Brooklyn's 33rd District and the Council's leading member on issues of regional planning, Joe Rose, who is Chair of the New York City Planning Commission and Director of the Department of City Planning, Richard Kahan, the former head of the state's Urban Development Corporation and now the President of the Urban Assembly, and Gail Benjamin, who directs the Land Use Division of the New York City Council. All of you are more than well informed about issues of planning for New York City. Now along comes this plan talking about a tri-state area. Let me begin by asking Joe Rose, from the perspective of someone who's charged with planning for New York City, how does the plan seem with respect to New York's future and its needs and concerns?
Well, it's a terrific effort. There are a bunch of things in it that we are enthusiastic about, especially the need to integrate open space planning into the development and economic development scenarios for the future of the region. There's no question that RPA has done a good job on that, and there are lots of aspects of it that we think should be examined even more carefully by some of the surrounding jurisdictions. And there are a lot of high bars that we would hope to clear in terms of living up to some of those open space requirements. And the focus on the need for infrastructure improvements as part of the long-term planning is absolutely crucial, and it's something that we on the city sides have been stressing for quite some time. We have to attend to our basic infrastructure demands. We have a bunch of concerns about some of the provisions of the plan itself, and I guess the issue in how you look at any plan comes down to, do you see this as a discussion document or is this an implementation strategy? And you can take very different perspectives. As a discussion document, there are a lot of important issues that are raised that I know Richard and the other panelists will discuss in depth, and we're happy to have some give and take. If I would point to, from the city's perspective, some of the biggest omissions, there's a lot of very enthusiastic and ambitious and exciting proposals for mass transit and rail-oriented investment in the plan. There's very little, almost no mention of the automobile, the truck, the highway infrastructure that is going to be important for the region's future. It's important for the region's present, and there's so much money being devoted in this plan to rail-oriented investment that it really doesn't place enough focus on automobile infrastructure as well. Another thing is it's a very government-oriented plan. It puts a great deal of the burden for making the region's future not apocalyptic, as in the region at risk, on the shoulders of government entities. And the fact is, to the extent that the region flourishes and prospers in the next several decades, it's going to be primarily because of what happens in the private sector side, with government acting as a protector and a facilitator and a collective investor in the appropriate context.
2 points then of imbalance: not enough attention to automobile and truck traffic issues and the infrastructure that they require, too much reliance on government to initiate. Richard Kahan, you're a member of the RPA board. They chose very consciously to cast this report in what Joe Rose has talked about as apocalyptic terms, that is, concern about grave perils here. Is the region at risk?
Well, I think there's no question the region is at risk. People are losing jobs. We have urban poverty in a number of parts of the region that is unprecedented in many ways and more hopeless in many ways than it's been. Suburbs and inner city are not working together. They're working at cross purposes when it's very clear that they need to be working as a unit in order to compete with other metropolitan regions around the world. Middle-class people are losing jobs. Our educational system is in tremendous disarray and not preparing people, not just children, but adults who need retraining as a result of higher technologies in the workplace are not being retrained for those jobs. So we have a problem. We're losing market share in every one of our growth industries, whether it's finance or telecommunications or biotechnology. And this state is limping along, for example, at about a 1% growth rate, which is half the nation's, which is not exactly aggressive. We're 48th, I think, in the nation in job creation. Now that is clearly a problem. What the plan then tries to do very quickly, and I think this is the important part, is take that scenario as a challenge. We are New Yorkers, New Jerseyans, Connecticut. I don't know how to put the suffix on Connecticut, but these are all states that have faced crises before, and particularly New York, and they have resolved them. The suggestion here is that the resolution is not through simplistic solutions, but through a long-term, serious strategy of investment in infrastructure and in the workforce and in the education systems and in human beings.
Well, you talk about the states individually having records of being able to confront problems and solve them. But clearly the report talks about tri-state cooperation, almost as if there should be some kind of regional governing processes, if not a regional government structure. And I know that's an issue we're going to want to dwell on at some length. But let's just first begin to appreciate something of the magnitude of the problem. You talked about the loss of jobs. The report says that between 1989 and 1992, 770,000 jobs lost in this tri-state region. That may be an exaggerated number, but it has to do with trying to tell the people in the region that they have a common stake. Now, Ken Fisher, from the perspective of one elected to the New York City Council, is this a mindset that elected officials and constituents in New York City are likely to buy into? That not only do they have something at stake in their city and in their state of New York, but in the well-being of these two other states as a region together?
Well, I think if you only talk to politicians, you'd find that there's a tremendous fear. Nobody wants to be the mayor or the governor that loses the Yankees to New Jersey, even if the impact on the regional economy would be relatively small. It would obviously have an impact on New York. But I think if you talk to average people, they understand that from a helicopter you can't see the boundaries. If we don't clean up the sewage that comes out of some of our plants and gets dumped into the harbor, it winds up on the shore of Long Island or the shore of Connecticut or the shore of New Jersey. If there's a traffic backup on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway outside my house in Brooklyn Heights, it can be felt all the way up to Gothel's Bridge and people coming in from New Jersey. The problems don't stop at the borders, and the solutions can't stop there either.
Gail Benjamin, with a great deal of experience in the realm of planning, how would a planner classically approach the issues raised in this report?
Run.
Not walk.
Right, run as fast as they can, probably in the opposite direction. Well, the first thing a planner would probably do is start getting information, which is one of the really important things in the RPA document. It's one of the first pieces of literature that has really compiled a great deal of information, both on the smaller and more local scale for the 3 states and on a wider scale for the tri-state area. From a professional planning point of view, information is the first critical link. What is the actual state? And I think RPA has done a tremendous job at pulling together information from all of those sources and then breaking it up and reconstituting it in a variety of ways so that you can measure both the local economic impacts of the last 10 years as well as the regional, or you can look at the state or citywide. The second thing that as a planner we would probably do is try and bring out those areas where there appeared to be commonality, whether they were commonality of problems, commonality of physical properties. Cities, for instance, we would start looking and setting up where are the cities and what are the characteristics of each one of the cities in these tri-state areas. by doing that, we'd try to attempt to gain additional information by putting the physical and the economic and other indicators together. And I'd say that would be the first step, and I certainly think that the RPA plan has done that. I think the harder step is moving from there to trying to define and understand the variety of problems that each area may face and that the area as a whole may face. They may be the same, they may be extremely different. While I would not pretend to have read and understood the entire report, I would say that certainly that is the area I think that discussion could begin on this report. I think we don't have agreement on what the problems may be, except in the most generic sense that there are fewer jobs than there are people. That it appears that the average income is not matching the average expense of the average family. That's a significant problem. That it appears that the distribution of goods and services networks within the city are breaking down more frequently and taking longer to arrive, meaning that the cost of goods continues to go up. We can all agree on those kinds of general problems, but as to how they were created, which regions suffer the most, sub-regions within the larger area, I don't think we have any consensus in this room, perhaps, or in the outer world.
Well, more likely, if we had representatives here from New Jersey and Connecticut, we'd probably find greater disagreement around the table. But gathering information, then diagnosing the problem, those are key steps for planners, and then kind of enunciating some common language as goals or objectives for the plan. RPA does that, and they do it in the form of 3 E's, which add up to their total package of what they're calling quality of life. And quality of life is a good way these days to try and phrase every issue that's out there in the public realm for discussion. Economy, environment, and equity. The economy, particularly in terms of jobs and the availability of future job growth. Environment in terms of the need for more and better open space. Equity in terms of the distribution of resources among various groups of people and their ability to use that economy in the larger society. Are those reasonable elements of the quality of life? Have they left anything out? Are those general enough categories in which to subsume everything?
How about E for education?
And it's an important part of what their implementation is about, because they, in addition to these 3 E's, they have 5 campaigns, 5 programmatic areas to address. A regional greensward, that is additional green open space, concentrating growth in the centers. Many of the local areas within this region are already developed. We've seen a new pattern of suburban sprawl, building office and retail complexes out at the edge of the older suburbs. That's sprawl. They're trying to tell us we have to withdraw from that. Improving mobility, which would include, one would assume, the kinds of things that you raised, Joe, about auto and truck traffic as well as mass transit availability. Investing in a competitive workforce, and that's where educational improvement is important, because for the region to attract the business, it's got to have the skilled, out-trained labor in various categories to do it, and then finally reforming governance.
Can I jump in for a second?
Please.
I think as the massive RPA plan and lots of the products that all of us who are involved in the planning enterprise can turn out, we can turn out a lot of verbiage, a lot of words. How we classify and what rhetoric we use is less important sometimes than the kernel of the ideas. And I think the essence of the RPA contribution, at least as we see it on the city side, is first of all to stress that we are a region, and regions are important economic entities, social entities in the current era, and that what the last 10 years have shown, or should have shown, all of us in the region, is that we sink or swim as a region. For a long time, the suburban environs did not think of themselves as tied to the New York City economy. One of the things that we saw, and that RPA calls out very well, is the fact that the job data and a lot of the other information is clear in terms of the fact that Nassau County, Essex County, all the counties around New York City are inherently intertwined with our economy, and we are in this together. And so a system of rating each other is not productive over the long haul, and while you may make marginal inroads and help yourself in the short term, if we spend all our time fighting with each other, we're going to suffer as a whole collectively. And now the problem comes to when we actually try to sort out, well, what does that mean, not fighting collectively? And we would say, well, that means New Jersey should stop trying to steal our businesses, and we would like not to have to deal with the Yankees with New Jersey panting over our shoulders and the like. We would like to address some of the port and transportation aspects of this collectively without having to worry about watching our pockets from our neighbors at the same time. New Jersey and Connecticut and some of the other counties in New York State would no doubt see it somewhat differently. But the notion that we have to act in a way that is cognizant of the fact that we're in this together is very important, and it's not something that has been politically internalized by any of the other actors. We in New York City, as the entity that has for a long time been holding the short end of the stick on this sort of regional cooperation front, have known this. If you look at the data in the RPA study, we did comparatively better than the surrounding suburban counties over that period of time, and hopefully this RPA document will start a process of collective cooperation.
But doesn't that also somewhat beg the question of, are we moving in a direction where we have more in common with the region, or in a direction where we have more in common with other megacities both around the country and around the world?
You don't have a choice in this. I mean, this is not a matter of picking the one we like. The world is now divided up into metropolitan regions. That is the economic unit that is competing. We are competing with metropolitan London, Hong Kong, Singapore, Sydney, Los Angeles, Seattle. That's the competitive environment, and the unit is a region in every single case. Joe is absolutely right. That is not the paradigm that people are thinking about. They're still thinking that somehow it's more important to worry about what New Jersey just took away from us than what LA might take away from both us, New Jersey, and Connecticut. But the important part about this plan, this is a vision. That's what the plan is. It's a vision that tries to change the way we think about large things, like the issue Joe just spoke about, but also about the 3 E's. We finally have come to the point where we realize that economic growth, which destroys natural resources, is not real economic growth. Or at least you have to deduct from what you thought you grew the things that you destroy that you can never replace, including human beings. We also, I think, are beginning to come to the point, not quickly enough, that economic growth, which may be environmentally sustainable but is not just, is not fair, is not equitable, is not the way to build a society that will continue to be competitive economically. It's not going to happen. It'll put too many stresses on the society and too many costs. Poverty costs a lot of money. You can either put people into the workforce, or you can continue to try and find different ways to pay for the consequences of not having people working. And what this plan is really about is getting everybody to the point where they can be working and this economy can be competitive and sustainable. That's the vision. Within that, the details are what we should be debating. And the good thing about it, I mean, why I'm grateful to you for doing this forum. When we released this plan, we didn't say, well, these are the points that we have to get the governors and the mayor to agree on. We said we have to start a debate. And this plan succeeds or fails to the extent that people debate its merits. It is up for the community at large, for the citizens, for the political leadership to decide which parts to implement or which parts to change or which parts to ignore. We need to debate it.
Let me ask you, I guess, a variant on a statement you made earlier, Ken, about the difference between politicians responding and citizens responding. Is it fair, do you think, to say that if citizens from the tri-state region heard this report, not that we expect them to read its hundreds of pages, but if they could get a distilled version, easily broadcast to them, that they would sooner come to a sense of being part of a region than elected officials who have to respond in narrower district or city or state terms?
Well, I think there's a lot of common sense aspects of the plan. One of them, for example, being to link the mass transit systems for the area. Well, if you've just been laid off from your job at IBM up in Armonk, and you have a possibility of a job in New Jersey, and there's no way to get from where you live to where the job prospect is, then the idea of a seamless mass transit system begins to make a lot of sense to you. But I think that the political difficulties inherent in this is one of the reasons that you haven't seen much governmental activity, and I'm not talking about at the professional level, but at the elected official level since the plan was released. The three governors, Rowland, Whitman, and Pataki, all participated in the release of the plan. They all spoke favorably about the concept of regional planning. Since then, they've been like jackrabbits caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. They popped up when the TV lights were on cue, but since then they've sort of studiously avoided the issue. And part of the reason, I think, is not to be partisan about it, but stepping back, you have three Republican governors who were each elected on the premise that they were going to have the government do less.
Right.
They
Smaller government.
Smaller government and less active government. Mayor Giuliani, to his credit, also a Republican, is an activist. He believes in using the power of government when it's appropriate. So to ask these three Republican governors to now cooperate and sit down and figure out how to set up a regional transportation system or to commit themselves to massive resources for protecting the environment just calls on them to do something that they may not be capable of doing.
Well, let's look at the question from the other direction. And we're talking about how can you create this regional cooperation and regional activity from the parts within the region who may have reasons why they can't come together as easily or naturally, even though citizens recognize it. Is this a role for the federal government to create more ways in which incentives for regional action on the part of cities and states?
There are some things, some of the political questions that are put forward from the New York City perspective are only going to be dealt with at the federal level. And it would be very nice if the region got together and said, let's put a gas tax. Now, I'm not calling for a gas tax, but it would be nice if the suburbs decided, we'll pay a gas tax so we can improve the transit infrastructure in the city of New York. That's not going to happen. To the extent, and if the region did it, if the region said, we will have a gas tax, but no other region has a gas tax, the region as a whole will suffer. If you do some kind of broad actions, especially when they involve taxation, it has to be done on a broad level. One of the things the New York economy and the regional economy has paid such a high price for is that we are a very high-taxed environment. And one of the reasons that we have had the job loss numbers that we have had is that it's a very expensive place to do business from the government side. Now, part of it is we haven't historically given the kind of services that you would expect from such high taxes, but you also have a very high tax burden. So I think some of the concerns, the grandest infrastructure projects called for in the RPA plan, if they're not coming from some nationally imposed either taxes or a more equitable distribution of our own tax money, New York, the New York metropolitan region, Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York combined, have a huge deficit with the federal government. We pump billions of dollars more into Washington than we get back, which is very much in contrast to most of the rest of the country. Unless we start getting some of those funds back or our taxes more equitably distributed at the national level, we're not going to be able to solve some of these challenges in front of us.
Is there, therefore, more reason, Richard, to say that this plan is too visionary? Can we expect the federal government, given the existence of a number of regions within the nation, which at least potentially are in competition, if not actually in competition with each other, can we expect the federal government to act to equalize the distribution of benefits among those regions or within those regions?
I don't think so. I think Joe is absolutely right. It would be very desirable. It's hard for me to imagine a political structure in Washington in the foreseeable future that would do that. There is no question that these things in the plan cost money. But at the end of the day, it's not as if we don't spend an enormous amount of money on governmental actions in this region right now. So I think we need to re-question what are we spending money on. For example, the region has 1,400, I think it is, taxing jurisdictions. That's pretty amazing. Everybody's got their own school district, their own fire truck, their own garbage sanitation department, et cetera. People don't want to give that up. There is a ton of money being wasted in that. There
Just
are other
administration of it.
administration and equipment. I mean, I'd much rather focus on some of the hardware than start talking about shedding more jobs, since I think we need more public jobs, not fewer public jobs. But there's money there, and there is money in this border warfare, which could stop. That takes leadership on the part of mayors and governors, which I think we've seen from time to time. That could stop. That's probably worth $1 billion a year. within this region. Now, $1 billion a year means that you could sell a bond that would raise $10 billion a year. Now, that's not small, or not a year, but $10 billion. That's not a small amount of money anymore. And maybe streamlining those jurisdictions and getting rid of government waste, which people like to talk about but don't do, really reinventing government in terms of these multiple jurisdictions, might raise another $1 billion. And that's another $10 billion towards infrastructure, education. And I think we can go on from there if we begin to look at the way we spend our money.
But again, it would require taking a different look, being willing to do things differently than we now do them. What will it take from a planner's perspective, if that's the role we've cast you in this evening, to be willing to do that? How do you get, especially folks in government, let alone the citizenry more broadly, to begin to look at things in a different light? Can we do it?
That question actually requires some thought, and I don't have an answer for it. It's very hard for most people, myself included, to really begin to think outside of the box. I live in New York City. I have lived in New York City for most of my life. I went to school in New York City. I elect New York City officials. And I feel a sense of, this is where I come from. When people say to me, where are you from? Certainly I don't say the tri-state area or the New York region. I say I'm from New York, and if they know New York at all, I say I'm from Brooklyn. So I think of the question as, how do I get me to think of saying something broader than New York or Brooklyn, or someone from Brooklyn, I come, from Fort Greene or Clinton Hill. I think we really need to, from a planning perspective, establish more commonalities. It's fine to talk about the public commonalities, you're right, the job loss, job creation, but that's not how people define themselves, I don't believe. And unless we can find the commonalities person to person, institution to institution, I think everybody here would remember the school crises of the 60s and 70s all over America, not just in New York City, when one of the issues was many people were talking about, do we simply bus children from Brooklyn to another part of Brooklyn, or do we take the hard step and try and look at it all as a circle with slices of the pie and bus kids between the suburbs and the city? We could never solve that problem or resolve it then, because it was clear that the suburban communities who were doing better than we were, they believed, and whose taxes were lower than our taxes, did not want to be associated with us. They did not want to be perceived as New York City people, nor did they want all of the images of crime, et cetera, that they thought went with it. Which is why I had suggested earlier that the perception of, are our interests in common with this region, is not one that I believe is widespread. Whatever the reality may be, I don't think the public perception is at all in that vein. I certainly think in schools, instead of having your third grade classes on New York City history, maybe it should be on regional history.
To begin to build consciousness that early. Is this part of the RPA intent here, to undertake a long-range sort of reorientation of people's consciousness?
Well, they only do this every 25 years, so I think the answer is, yeah, I think the consciousness is absolutely what has to change first, and it sort of comes back to your first question to me, which is this region at risk, and why did we select this name? This is a real crisis. People may not have perceived it yet. They're perceiving it as lots of individual tragedies. People at IBM, are being laid off and can't find jobs, or when they do, they're at half the rate that they were, and people in poverty are feeling more hopeless than ever before. And we all notice that the infrastructure doesn't seem to be what it should be, and why can't we get to the airport the way we ought to, and truck drivers are stuck in tunnels, with their profits going up in smoke, and construction workers are out of work. So there are a lot of individual experiences, but it's really part of the same crisis. We have not come out of that recession you alluded to before. When we lost those 750,000 jobs up to '92, the rest of the country lost jobs. The difference here is that when the rest of the country regained them after 1992, we didn't. We are still in that depression. Now, when you're in a depression or a serious recession or any kind of crisis, it seems to me you change the way you think and you change the way you do things and you try and attack what's attacking you. We've done it historically, and that's what's going to have to happen now. This is not a small problem or a temporary or cyclical problem.
Well, your comments are a good point for us to take our segue to that portion of the forum where we invite students to come and pose questions to the panel. Would you tell us your name and your college and put your question?
My name is Suji from the College of Staten Island. Why does the regional plan report ignore Staten Island?
Why does the report ignore Staten Island? Would you care to comment, Mr. Kahan?
I don't think it does, but if it, I really don't think it does. It certainly doesn't mean to or intend to. I mean, I can't imagine that there's any reason why Staten Island isn't as integral part of this region as every other part of the region, and certainly every part of the city. It's certainly a vital part of the economy. It's a vital part of the transportation network, a vital part of shipping and port.
Well, the only reason why I asked is because I didn't hear it mentioned at all.
You mean in this conversation?
Yes.
Well, the report is it would take us all, if we read in turns, it would take us about 5 days to get through it. So I suggest you look at the report, and if you find that to be true, then I'd like to discuss it some more with you.
We'll correct the imbalance if there is one. Wouldn't it be fair to say, I mean, New York City is barely 100 years old, and despite the Staten Island movement to secession, which seems to have come to a temporary, if not a permanent halt at the moment, that was the first attempt at regional government, creating a city of 5 counties, which is itself an anomaly in American local government. Now that experiment isn't 100 years old, and here we are worried about the larger region. It may tell us something, but let's take our next student question first. Please.
Good evening. My name is Mark Wegman. I'm from Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn. My question is posed to the panel, each one of you. Basically, it has been said that we are in a minor depression, basically the whole country as a whole. Now, my question to you is basically, since we're in a minor depression, we have to think about where is the money going. Basically, I do think that in bureaucracy, that's where the problem lies. There's a lot of members in the bureaucracy that are wasting money, which wasteful spending is going on, and there's also corruption, and they're not accountable to their fellow members and constituents. Now, my question to you is basically, how do we get these members out of the bureaucracy that waste the money, whether it's in education, welfare, or any type of basically bureaucracy in New York or elsewhere in the country of America?
Councilman Fisher, I know that you're going through the council review of the mayor's management report, so maybe we'll toss this question on cutting back on bureaucracy and saving money to you.
Well, I think part of the answer is that we have to change the way we measure what the government does. One of the movements that's taken hold in terms of reinventing government is measuring outcomes rather than outputs. A diploma is an output. An educated child is an outcome. An arrest is an output. A lowered crime rate is an outcome. And you're right that there's a lot that has to be done in terms of reforming bureaucratic practices. I chair the council subcommittee that deals with the siting of municipal facilities. And some time ago, the city came to me and told me that they wanted to open up a new food stamp office. Now, this happened to be for working poor people. They made too much money to be on welfare, but they could still use the helping hand of food stamps. And they have to come in twice a year to be certified as to their eligibility. So they took me out to the site, and I asked how many clients were going to come to this office every day, and they said 100. And I said, how many people are going to work here? It seemed like a very big building. And they said 42. So I said, no, there must be some mistake. So they took me to the existing overcrowded office down the street where 40 to 50 clients a day were serviced by 22 city workers, 2 receptionists, 2 security guards, 3 clerical people, 11 interviewers who did 5 interviews a day, 3 supervisors for the other 19 employees, and a couple of clericals. I said, I'm not going to do this. I said, this is ridiculous. And they said, Mr. Fisher, what do you care? This is all federal dollars. There's no city money involved with this. And I said, that's why Newt Gingrich is the speaker, because people will reach into their pockets to make sure that folks don't get hungry, but they won't reach into their pockets to create make-work jobs where people sit around doing nothing all day. But I think that one of the aspects of the plan that goes to the question of the allocation of government resources has to do with creating a tri-state congressional delegation, getting the congressmen and women from New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York to meet together and to come up with a common agenda. Now, in the old days, they were driven by the same kind of neighborly rivalry that the governors suffer from. Now what's happened is that the 105th Congress is going to be whacking up all of the supposed savings from the welfare bill based on writing into the law certain formulas for the distribution of money. Well, you can be sure that the members of Congress from the South are going to be there as a block at the table trying to define poverty in such a way as to benefit their areas. You can be sure that the congressional representatives from the West are going to be doing the same thing. In the past, I don't think there would have been any chance of the tri-state delegation getting its act together, but every time Newt Gingrich takes the floor of the Congress and bashes New York, those congressmen from Hartford and Bridgeport and Trenton and Newark, they realize that the same formula that cuts our throat is slashing their wrists. And I think they have an incentive to work together to fight that.
And that certainly is a leading recommendation, the creation of this tri-state congressional caucus.
That's actually happening. RPA has been meeting with the congressional leadership from all 3 states and getting very good responses. So I think that will occur.
And that, you know, it goes to show, those are the elected officials at the grassroots level, as opposed to the perspective from the governor's offices. So they're sensing they would not be doing that if they didn't sense it was both in their region's interest and also in their local political interest.
A case where both of those line up in the same direction. Yes?
Yes, my name is Sonia Takeuchi. I'm from Baruch College. And I just wonder if is there anything in regards to foreign investment in the tri-state region?
I'm sorry.
To encourage
foreign investment?
To encourage foreign
Yes.
investment.
Is there anything to encourage foreign investment?
I think to the extent that the plan is aimed at being attractive to business investment, period, the answer is clearly yes. As part of this is one of the great global cities. There is an enormous amount of more capital flowing through the city probably every day than any other city in the world. A lot of it's foreign money. We'd like it to stay here and be invested here in our future and in capital programs that improve productivity. And the things that those foreign investors want are the very same things that the investors and businesses that are already here that we've spoken to want. And it gets back to your question about quality of life. And while, yes, it sounds like a very vague concept, RPA did a serious study with Quinnipiac College. We had focus groups with leaders of industry from all of the relevant industries, and they kept saying the same things about what they meant by quality of life. They did not talk about taxes, and they did not talk about red tape. They did talk about sense of community. They talked about public safety, something that New York City is certainly addressing in a dramatically successful way. They talked about parks, environment, ease of getting around, which means transportation and infrastructure, quality of the schools. The same things that everybody in the community wants are the same things that will attract foreign investors.
You mentioned earlier, Richard, that RPA does its plans about once every 25 years. And perhaps it takes that quarter of a century after the plan first comes out to begin to change the mindset and then to build the support to implement some of its major aspects. So that if we're a little down on the possibility of changing the perceptions of a 20 million person citizenry overnight, it should not be a surprise. We didn't get regional transportation initiatives within the state or among the states for some time after those things were first mentioned, for example. But as we look at the elements of this plan, I guess one thing that we keep coming back to more than anything else, whether we are arguing that government should take the protective or initiating role, the role of government is seen as important. In the context of American politics these days, where cutting the size of government, cutting the bureaucracy, we heard a student mention that earlier. Cutting services because we're cutting taxes and everybody wants to have lower taxes. And even if it means fewer or poorer services, we'll pay the price. Can government play a role here, or does government have to do that which will maybe mobilize the private sector to play a greater role?
think it's primarily the latter, but it's important to realize that the energy of the private sector has always been released by public investments in infrastructure. Without the roads, without the airports, without the ports, without the information highway, without the internet, there is no private sector investment, productivity, energy, and all of those things have been government activities. So there is a proper role for government. And the same, I think, is probably true, although to a much lesser extent than we're doing it now, when it comes to human capital. I'm becoming a firm believer, as I look at this more and more, that far more of our educational system and our training system for people that have graduated from the public schools should be concentrated in the private sector, with a lot of public sector oversight, participation, encouragement, etc. But it seems to me what we're talking about here with the educational system is creating the opportunity for people to be in the workforce at a living wage, and that is something that the private sector needs to be far more involved in, and in other countries like Germany and Japan is.
Mm-hmm. Gail, in a lot of your work, which is technically in the area of land use, but really about planning and development in the city, have we gotten any better at this encouraging the private sector to play a role over the last couple of decades, do you think?
I would say we've had different trends. Certainly in the early part of the 70s, we attempted through incentive zoning to encourage private persons, private development, to produce some of the infrastructure for us. We created some things called special transportation districts. And if someone built in that area, they also built a part of our transportation system. We created parks improvement districts. If you built in those particular areas, you either gave a contribution or in some cases directly assisted government in rebuilding or building anew certain parks. We incented people to build their own green spaces, particularly in Manhattan and in the most crowded and lowest served area in terms of open space. We allowed people to build additional floors on their buildings if they provided a public meeting area, a plaza, a galleria, a relief to the dense urban environment. And that certainly was very common through the 70s and the beginning of the 80s. Some of the incentive zoning worked extremely well. I would certainly say that if any of you, and I'm sure you have been to the 53rd Street, the F train station connecting to the 51st Street, number 6, that was as a result of incentive zoning. And that was done very well. However, we also have Grace Plaza, which is on 43rd Street in back of this building that was supposed to be a open, greener relief space, which has been a problem from the day it was constructed. As a result, I would say in the 80s we retrenched on incenting people privately via zoning. And we paid more attention to incenting people via taxes and a variety of tax proposals, the ICIP program, which is an economic development set of proposals, a variety of loan programs to try and incent private development to locate both within certain areas which critically needed additional economic activity, and to encourage them to remain anywhere within the city when considering relocation.
And we're now in one of the federal government's great experiments, which is the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone, as another attempt to provide incentives to get industry to locate, to undertake economic activity which will yield up jobs. As you sit as a member of the council, Ken, on many of the same questions, and they often are framed in political terms, do you find that there's a difference in the attitude in government about encouraging the private sector, or is the private sector different in its response to what government seems to be encouraging it to do?
Well, I think that we've had some experience here in New York with public-private partnerships, and I think that that's probably the model. The traditional institutional model and the strict separation of the economic sectors is no more relevant today than the typical organizational structure of the large corporation. We're talking about flattening bureaucracies across the board and strategic alliances. And I think that that's what the regional plan actually represents, is suggesting not just a strategic alliance between the three states, but a strategic alliance between the various sectors of the economy in the three states. Whatever the anti-government rhetoric of the times are and the cynicism that people have about government, when push comes to shove, there are certain fundamentals that the plan embraces. People want to know that if they turn on the water faucet, that what comes out is going to be safe to drink. They want to know that their kid is going to get a decent education in school and is going to be safe going to and from there. They want to know that they're going to be able to get to work on time and that there's going to be a job for them and a job for their kids. And I think most people understand that that's not something that the private sector can do by itself, nor is it anything that the government can do by itself. It is a function of joining those interests. And that's simple common sense.
Mm-hmm. From the point of view of RPA as a kind of think tank organization that develops grand ideas and puts them out there for people to hold forums about and conduct conferences and so on, is there also an attempt to build anything at the grassroots level in terms of spreading the awareness and developing this kind of regional consciousness, or does there need to be by RPA or somebody else?
The second part of the question, I think there clearly needs to be. These kinds of changes are not going to take place. Some of the implementation required is not going to be popular. For example, the simple idea that maybe we ought to pay for what we use at the full cost of using it, it's not something people accept. People drive on the highways. They have no real interest in paying for the costs of cleaning the air, fixing the potholes. They are heavily subsidized. They don't know that they're subsidized. They don't want to hear that they're subsidized. But if you look at our gas prices versus those of every other country in the world, you have to realize, since the oil is coming from the same place, that somebody must be getting subsidized. And somebody must be getting subsidized at somebody else's expense. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of tough decisions, and we're not going to come to grips with them unless there is a good understanding of why we need to discuss these things at the grassroots level. And to the extent that RPA is not any better equipped than a lot of other organizations to do that, they are doing their part in terms of creating discussion with all sorts of groups around the region, and I think it's up to every civic organization, every educational organization, every part of the media to, again, as I said earlier, stimulate this debate.
There's another aspect of that, Ed. When the first plan was released in 1929, you could fit everybody that you needed to reach consensus in Mrs. Astor's ballroom. 200 people in the city of New York and their colleagues from the suburbs could make the decisions that led to the building of highways and parks and so forth. In 1968, when the next plan was released, that was a break point in terms of how government and people in this country related to each other. The Chicago Convention, the assassinations, the Vietnam War, the beginning of the cynicism exacerbated by Watergate and Iran-Contra. Today, you couldn't take 500 people, put them in the same room, and then cause the plan to be implemented. Mm-hmm. It now takes perhaps 50,000 people. That's one of the reasons why, when the plan was released, it was promoted on television. That's why these forums are so important, because without the broad consensus, without the grassroots, without democracy from the bottom up, you're not going to be able to get any of these things accomplished.
Mm-hmm. And Gail, you told us earlier that one thing we needed to do if we were going to build the consciousness was even begin to affect the curriculum in schools to create a regional awareness instead of just a narrow New York City look. Is that a possible thing to do, do you think? Can we recreate a kind of broader regional civic consciousness instead of a narrow one that seems to be the case?
I think we can start and we can make serious inroads in it. As you said from the beginning, New York is only 100 years old, and that New York is not the physical New York you see today. A lot of the city's growth has been accomplished by incorporating yet more physical property into the city's inventory. Mm-hmm. Both in the Bronx particularly, where as recently as the 1940s, the last area was incorporated and added to the city's inventory. So I think that, yes, it is possible. People in Pelham don't talk about themselves as Pelhamites. they believe they're from the Bronx. I think we have those examples that show us it is possible to form a more regional consciousness as the benefits, as the education occurs, the benefits occur, and as the city extends, or as whatever the region is to be called. And I think it is important to find a name for such a region.
Other than New York, so that Connecticut, New Jersey won't resent it.
Absolutely. That you have to call it something, and as that thing begins to take on a life of itself, as it has a political center, as communications start to move between the thing, as we agree on certain kinds of taxation or educational principles, no matter where you move within that area, you can expect the same things. I think that you will find that people begin to accept it and to believe that they are part of, I don't know, New Connecticut.
The fact is we really do need each other, and that's the conversation that has to take place. It's not possible for people in the suburbs to make the living they want, have the universities they want, unless this is a healthy city, and this city is very dependent on people that live in the suburbs, and there's no question that we are really in this together.
And that speaks to a part of the political debate between city and suburbs that I think often gets overlooked. Several years ago, under the former mayor, there was a major conference of mayors around the city that was held here in New York, an urban summit. And as part of that preparation for that summit, another national opinion survey was commissioned. And it looked at the people who lived in the suburban rings around the major cities of the United States. And they were asked questions about the city which was the focus of their suburbs, that is, the city which those suburbs surrounded. They recognized it as a place that they went to, relied on, or depended upon for work and career and status, for health care, and for cultural opportunity. And they were willing to support improving conditions in those cities, even though elected officials, whether they be governors or members of the state legislature or whatever, from those areas, didn't think that their constituents would do it. The constituents are ahead of the elected officials.
I'll add one piece of information to that. The National League of Cities did a study last year on, I think, 25 of the largest cities in the country. They found that in every single case, when the inner city, when the central city was doing well economically, the suburbs' incomes were going up. And in every single case when the central city's economy was doing badly, the suburban incomes were going down. This is not a question, again, of choice. We really are in this together, and that's the mindset that has to be created.
And now that we've had the aging out of many of the suburbs closest to the city, that is, they've grown to a sufficient age to have experienced some of the social change, the upheaval, and the problems we associate with cities, they're beginning to see that commonality of interest. How we build upon that commonality of experience to build political consciousness is a part of the puzzle that I think we don't know yet, but the report reminds us we have to take a look at it. As we are coming to the end of the forum, I just wanted to ask each of you in turn, and I do want to acknowledge that Chairman Rose from the City Planning Commission had to leave for another scheduled appointment, which is why he's not here for our wind-up. Ask each of you, as you reflect upon the report and the kind of thrust of the direction that it goes in, what do you think are the most important things for us to be talking about and doing in the years ahead? Ken, let me start with you.
Well, I think one of the unstated issues that has to be put on the table and addressed openly has to do with the impact of racism on the policy decisions. For a lot of the suburban communities, people fled there out of a sense of panic that their neighborhoods at home in the city were being taken over by people that they didn't identify with. And it became their excuse for turning their backs on the cities and the other urban areas of the region. So I think that we have to understand that that way of thinking is counterproductive, that the panic reaction, you have to let the adrenaline go by. You have to understand that we really are all of this together.
Gail?
Well, I would certainly agree with Ken on the question of social and racial justice and where and how that plays into a region's plans. Certainly as the core areas have become more minority, I think there has been a feeling of disinvestment, whether in fact the numbers prove out or not. I think that has become a significant obstacle, both towards regionalization. I think the perception in America, we have always had some anti-urban bias. And I think the perception of cities in this country is a poor one. That has not been conquered. I think people, and I've heard them say it, New York is a cesspool, let it sink. I think that's a major problem towards our ideas of regionalism. I also think that in a tight economy, people are terrified, and they don't perceive the economic advantage of how regionalism, of how letting the Yankees go to New Jersey is going to improve their prospects. And that, I think, is up to all of us to do.
Okay. Richard?
This is a challenge. It's a call to arms. This is a very exciting time. The global economy is here. Technology is taking us in places that we never dreamed it would. People are suffering as a result of that, and people are succeeding beyond their wildest dreams as a result of that. What this report is basically saying is that here is a vision for the future. It is a frightening prospect and a challenging prospect at the same time. And this is not a group of people, certainly New Yorkers, for the ones that I know, that have shrunk in front of those kinds of challenges in the past. We built the Erie Canal when we needed to, and we built the SUNY system and the CUNY system when we needed to, and we built our rails and ports, and now it's time, again, I think, to think about building a better future for everyone.
A challenge with respect to the future based on a report that tells us that that future is at risk. For joining us here on the CUNY Forum, let me thank Gail Benjamin, in his absence, Joe Rose, Ken Fisher, and Richard Kahan. Thank you from the students and faculty at the City University, and we'll see you at next month's CUNY.